Hey guys, welcome. We are now in episode 3 of our Filipino American Ministry podcast. My name's Aaron, and I'm with my co-host Henrik. So if you guys like this podcast, please subscribe.
Yes, welcome everyone. Today we'll be talking about what does it mean to be Filipino American. So let me start.
Wow.
Let me start with asking you, Aaron, what does it mean to be Filipino American for you?
I was looking over the questions that you wrote down, and this question: Are Filipino Americans task oriented or people oriented?
Okay, we can talk about those. Yeah.
I think that's kind of interesting because I'm definitely more task oriented, and my wife, who's very Filipino, is more people oriented.
Mhm.
But I do think that's kind of like putting a whole group of people onto one camp. I'm pretty sure that there are task oriented Filipinos. But in general, I think that for me, at least in my experience, Filipinos in general are more people oriented.
More people oriented.
Yeah, and I think that's why there's a lot of Filipino nurses. You know, we just kind of fit that job.
Yeah.
Very socially warm people, I suppose. What do you think?
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned about the nurses because I just remembered that Filipinos also do a lot of. They're also maids, also in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess you're saying that Americans, like if you're more American, you become more task oriented.
Well, I think in general, American culture, you tend to be more task oriented. Again, this is kind of painting with a broad brush, right? Because not all Americans are task oriented. There's a lot of, well, we don't really know the statistics, but it seems like, at least for this culture, comparing to Filipino culture, it seems like American culture would be more task oriented than people oriented.
Okay.
You know, like even in the way we define success is like how much stuff have you done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was talking with Sarah yesterday, or not yesterday, a few days ago, about this question. I was asking her if she thinks Filipinos are people oriented or task oriented. And she told me that she's seen like a mix, or she's seen like half, where Filipinos can be task oriented and then there are Filipinos who are people oriented. There is one organization she talked about, Crew Philippines. She said that they're more task oriented. So she's seen that side of task oriented Filipinos. But I think something interesting is that Crew Philippines is also from America, or like it's a branch of an American organization.
Mm-hmm.
So that DNA may have like that mindset may have came into the Filipino branch. But I think after that conversation, it sounds like Filipinos in general are not task oriented or people oriented. They're like a half.
Well, sorry, I think if you put it this way, right? If you like, for example, pit those two together, like would Filipinos wait for someone before they start something or before they go somewhere? Let's say you agree to meet at like 1:00 in the afternoon. A task-oriented person would start at 1:00. Right. A people-oriented would like wait, even if it means like waiting 1 hour or 2 hours. Right. Like I feel like in American culture, that's just like, it's rude to do that. We're branching off in the area of like how we perceive time, but for Filipinos, they would rather wait than start in general.
Yeah. So I guess I was gonna say that, like Sarah said, it's like half, but I think in my experience and in what I've seen, I kind of think that they're more people oriented, just because, what you said about waiting for someone during a meeting, and also like I think Filipinos are more collectivist, so I think that collectivist mentality can also come into being people oriented. So I guess that also translates into Filipino Americans. At least the first generation Filipino Americans, they seem more people oriented. And then I think it kind of creeps into the second gen.
What about you, Henrik? Are you task oriented or people oriented?
I'm definitely people oriented.
You are?
Yeah. Because, well, I don't know. It's like in engineering, I'm task oriented, but then when I'm like at church, I'm people oriented. It's weird. It's like in my job, I'm more like getting the task done, but then, or like at least in the academics, when I make friends, it's usually because I'm like, hey, let's study together because it's like there's a task that we're trying to do. But then when I come to church, like if I have a like kind of what you said, like if we have a meeting, I kind of wait for people before having the meeting, or like if it's if I give a task to someone and then they don't do it, I'm not like overly. I guess I'm not really like trying to get them to get the job done. I guess I care about my relationship with them too.
Yeah.
So I guess it's kind of weird. It's like I'm different depending on the context.
Is that a Filipino thing, being very adaptable?
I don't know. Do you think Filipinos are task oriented when it comes to the workplace?
I think it depends. Filipinos are very adaptable in the sense that, like, if they end up working in an American company where there are strict rules, yeah, they can adjust, I think. But in general, if you give them the opportunity to choose, they'd rather be late, or they'd rather not late in the sense that like they don't care, but I don't know. It seems like Filipino Americans in general are more people oriented.
So they like to be more flexible with the time.
Yeah, flexible. Not too rigid with the time. I think that's kind of part of being not task oriented. If you're task oriented, then you have to be rigid with the time. There's just no way around it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the next question.
Yeah.
Could you give like a general summary of what it means to be Filipino American? So I guess generally answer the question.
Okay. I think being Filipino American, it's not. I think it's more of like a spectrum, right? Like you could be very Filipino and a little bit American. I don't know. It's kind of hard to define it. Like I feel like there's a spectrum of being Filipino American. It's not very narrow, right? Like I feel like I'm Filipino American, even though I grew up half my life in the Philippines, and you consider yourself Filipino American, even though you grew up in the U.S., right? To define being Filipino American, even for me, it's kind of hard for me to define that. Like it's very hard to narrow it down to general characteristics of what it means to be Filipino American. I mean, maybe if you have a mix of Filipino and American culture, you could be Filipino American. But I mean, I've met people who are mostly American culture, but they have Filipino skin, consider themselves Filipino American. So it's kind of really hard for me to define that. What do you think?
Okay, so you mentioned a spectrum. Are you thinking like Filipinos on this side, Americans on this side, and then you fall in between?
Yeah, somewhere in
like
between
that?
there.
So if you're in any part in that line, you're Filipino American?
Yeah, but I also think that you also have to think of yourself as Filipino American.
Okay, so I think you that identification probably.
Yeah, you have to self-identify as one, because if you don't, then yeah. I mean, maybe I would consider you Filipino American even if you don't consider yourself one. But I think self-identification is important.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think Philippines, at least in the cities, are sounding like they're becoming Americanized. So it's kind of hard to draw that, like, which one is, if it's, like, I think, like, my wife, for example, I think, like, I get along well with her. Or maybe it's just because she's my wife, so that naturally that's why it is. But I kind of, like, she understands my culture, like American culture, but she doesn't consider herself to be Filipino American. She considers herself to be Filipino. And also, like, some of my cousins.
Same with my wife.
Yeah, it's like some of my cousins too is, like, they seem to understand me, but at the same time, they don't identify themselves as American. So it's kind of interesting how that works. Yeah. So I guess I
think that's why it's really hard to define what it means to be Filipino American. I mean, you could say, like, geographic, maybe, like Filipinos who live in America, who hold on to Filipino culture. But what about, like, Filipinos born here who maybe move back? I don't know. So it's kind of really hard to define it. I think you have to self-identify as one.
Okay. Yeah, good point.
I mean, it could be like some people identify themselves as Filipino American. Their culture is American, but their heritage is Filipino. I think that's how Filipino Americans broadly identify themselves, at least from what I've seen when I was there in Maryland.
What do you mean by that? Could you explain that more? Like, they identify as American, but their heritage?
They're, like, culturally, they're American.
Oh, okay.
Like, if you ask them what their culture is, or if you look at their culture more closely, it's American. But their heritage, like where they're from, right, is Filipino.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what we're trying to talk about here is more of, like, the cultural aspect.
Okay. Could you explain the difference between culture and heritage?
Yeah, so I guess like their roots, or their race, maybe. So that's what I would consider heritage, and culture is more of the learned behaviors and thought patterns.
I see.
Or, like, how you think. So they don't. When I'm talking about culture, it's something that it's kind of like how you think, right? Like, you could be standing to another Filipino guy, but just the way that you think about the world, your worldview is different.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. Hope it does.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay. What about me?
Yeah. What does it mean to be Filipino American for you?
Oh, yeah.
It's a hard question, man.
I think for me, Filipino American is just it just means that you grew up in America, or, like, you lived some part of your life in America, and but then your race, or your, like, I guess your race is Filipino, or you have parents who are Filipino, or Filipino American. Yeah, you have parents who are either Filipino or Filipino American.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But your culture is like American, but you look at your heritage, your roots are Filipino.
Yeah, I think something I want to do is, like, I want to do a distinction between first gen and second gen, because I think they're really different. The first gen.
Hold on. Before you go there, but that's what I was saying. Like, that's not how I think about Filipino American. Of, like, you look at Filipino American as just some Filipino who grew up in the U.S.
Well, what about our parents?
Mostly. yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, because you can have people who've been here when they were young. Like, I met some Filipinos who've been here since they were very young, but they consider themselves Filipino, especially in places where they grew up in communities where it's all Filipino. So, like, they still have a heavy accent. They talk with mostly just like Filipinos. They interact with mostly just in a Filipino community. And for them, they consider themselves Filipino and not Filipino American,
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
even though they grew up here. I think it's different for like at least for our friends like you. You grew up in Maryland, but in Maryland, the it's not that many Filipinos there. You know, so you're kind of really forced to interact with other communities, right? But there are like, for example, Chinese people who maybe live in like a community where it's all Chinese and they speak Chinese and they eat Chinese food. So it's like a bubble of like that community in that one area. And maybe they go out a little bit, but they can live in a community where that culture is kind of like the same. You don't have to like adjust.
Yeah, I think Vincent has told me, my friend Vincent, he told me that, yeah, there's some Chinese people in like Chinatown areas, and they basically live as though like they were in China. Like everything is the same. They never had to learn English because everything is in Chinese. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so
they're
like
just in a different location, but they're all everything is the same.
Yeah, that's right. Like in California, for example, there's a lot of Filipinos. So, you know, like there are pockets or areas where they don't need to venture out as much, or at least the community doesn't change their culture. Their interactions doesn't change how they think or their culture. Right. So I think that's why it's important to kind of self-identify as one.
Yeah. So you don't think... so how about first generation and second generation? Do you think there should be a distinction or no?
I think in general, it's good to have the distinction just because it's easier to talk about them. And I think there's enough difference in culture.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is like, if this was the spectrum of Filipino American, first generation would be more towards Filipino, and second generation would be more towards American culture.
Yeah.
And there's whole people are just in between the spectrum.
Yeah, depending on what time you came to the U.S. and
your community, what kind of community you live in. Like if you put a Filipino in Iowa or somewhere where there's not that many Filipinos, they're gonna be towards more American, I think.
Oh yeah.
You're just forced to be in that community, but but a Filipino where there's like a lot more Filipinos in that city or community. They have availability of Filipino restaurants and Filipino churches and Filipino communities.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think of that.
Yeah, so I think it's that's why it's hard to pin down what it means to be Filipino American, because someone right here who's like maybe first generation. I mean, I came here when I was 15. Might consider themselves more Filipino American, right? And someone right here who's like, who knows very little Filipino culture but knows his heritage might consider himself Filipino American.
Yeah, good point.
And I wouldn't say like you're not Filipino American if you like you don't have these qualities. You know, it's kind of hard to really pin down.
Yeah. Interesting. So I want to bring up some famous people that might be Filipino American. We can talk about them. So Apple the App, do you think he's Filipino American?
Definitely more American. But
More
he
American.
he identifies as Filipino American, right? Like he's proud of his culture.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know it's interesting. I think he's more Filipino than me, though.
Why? Oh, he grew up in the Philippines. He's more like 1.5, right?
Yeah, because he grew up in the Philippines, and he actually speaks Tagalog. I don't speak Tagalog.
That's right.
I mean, I try to, but I'm not. I think he's better than me at Tagalog. And then he also like does a lot of shows in the Philippines. So he seems to be more Filipino than me. So if it was a spectrum, I'd probably be closer to the American side, and then he'll be like here
somewhere.
Yeah. And it's interesting. He's not full-blooded Filipino too. He's a mix. But yeah, I think he's more Filipino than I am. Huh?
All right. That's interesting. Okay, so when it comes to heritage, you're more Filipino.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, because he has a mixture of heritages. He has, I don't know what his heritage or nationality or race he is, but yeah, he's only part Filipino.
Well, when it comes to culture, he's more Filipino.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Okay, how about Bruno Mars? What do you think?
I'm not sure. I think of Bruno Mars. I think he's a mix of a lot, right?
Yeah,
I don't know how much.
He grew up.
I think what?
He grew up in Hawaii, I think.
Yeah, lots of Filipinos there.
Yeah, but I don't think I see his Filipino culture that much.
Yeah, same here.
I think it's still weird to think of him as Filipino American. Like with Apple the App, I can say, yeah, he's Filipino American. But with Bruno Mars, it seems like people are stretching it when they say he's Filipino American.
I think that's just Pinoy pride.
Yeah, it's like Pinoy pride. They're like trying to say he's Filipino, but I don't know. I know he's proud of his heritage, though. I know he's proud to be Filipino, but it doesn't come out much. Like at least in Apple the App, he wrote songs in Tagalog. Like he rapped in Tagalog.
Yeah, I think that's where self-identification again comes in.
Yeah.
You know,
it would be nice if Bruno Mars wrote a song in Tagalog.
Yeah.
Okay, how about Joe Coy? Actually, this is interesting because Joe Coy, he really identifies himself as Filipino. Like he has like a lot of his comedy is based around that identity.
Maybe that's why he identifies as Filipino.
Because of his comedy.
Yeah, because that's his main audience.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah, it could be. But when he does his, like, I guess, what do you call those? Spiels or his comedy bits? Like, I think he understands the Filipino American experience. Like having a mom who is Filipino. I think I resonate with his jokes, especially about language. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting though. I think like he did one show on Netflix where he invited other Filipino Americans, and I think they went to the Philippines or something like that. But it's just like, I mean, he can be funny, but the other ones just like it's not connecting with the Filipino audience as much.
Oh, really? He went to the It was in the Philippines.
They went to the Philippines.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it was an interesting show. But Jokoy, I think that he can identify a little bit, or at least a lot more than the others.
Yeah. I don't know much about Gerald Anderson, but when I looked him up, I was hoping you would know about him more, but I guess you don't.
The actor, right?
Yeah, but it's interesting. He grew up a lot. He grew up a large amount of time in America, and then
Where?
I forgot where.
Is it Iowa or California?
I have a feeling it's in the East Coast. I can't remember exactly.
New York, maybe.
Yeah, like New York or New Jersey, something like that. I can't remember. Sorry, listeners, for not knowing Gerald Anderson's place.
But I think you can see how like it makes a difference where you grow up in the U.S.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
You know, like for me, hold on, sorry. Just a quick story. Like for me, I had no choice but to like hang out with you guys.
Oh yeah,
because there's no other like Filipino community at that time.
Well,
I
there
mean,
was.
there was, but at that time, like I wasn't driving. I can't ride the jeepney to go to there, but I have to see you guys on Sundays. So
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
there was BMAC.
yeah, but that wasn't as regular.
Oh yeah, it wasn't
Yeah,
regular.
yeah. BMAC is our tribal peoples.
Yeah, for the listeners, yeah, BMAC is our Igorot organization.
Community, yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah, Gerald Anderson actually, he grew up a long time in America, and actually when he was in the Philippines, he didn't speak Tagalog. Actually, like I think it was Pinoy Big Brother he was on, and Sarah told me that he didn't speak Tagalog, so that's interesting. But then now I feel like he's really Filipino, like he's really immersed in the Filipino culture, and yeah, and also like Sam Milby. It's interesting. Sam Milby, he's also. I used to like him, like when I would watch the teleseries, because he would be like someone I could identify with. Like he's Filipino and American, and then he has an accent when he speaks Tagalog, apparently. And then people have told me that when I speak Tagalog, I sound like Sam Milby. That's what they always say.
Sam Milby.
Yeah. But I guess in the spectrum, he'd be like more on the, because he's lived more in the Philippines, or he gained his popularity in the Philippines. He's more on the Filipino side than American, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't really know him that much.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the next question. What are the common? Let's name some common Filipino American experiences. And yeah,
you should start that one. I'm not so sure.
Okay. Well, I think when I wrote this question, I was thinking of like the Filipino American experiences of we would watch Manny Pacquiao, like we will gather at Tita or Tito's house to watch Manny Pacquiao, and then some experiences is like I would be bringing rice to my school, and then I would have rice and like I don't know, adobo, and then like my American friends, like I grew up some part of my life in Pennsylvania, and there was no Asians there whatsoever. And they would always say like, "Oh, what are you eating? Like, what is that?" And then they would think it smells bad, too, because it was weird to them.
Yeah.
So that part of my experience was like having to be ashamed of my food, like being ashamed of eating my lunch.
My wife makes the best adobo. I hope my kids won't have to experience that.
Yeah, and then I think it's actually a common thing for most Asian Americans in general, like that experience.
Is that a struggle or a joy?
So it's two things. It's a struggle to have your friends look at you funny for your food, but it's also a joy because I think, at least for me, I think Filipino food is really nice. I think that's one of the joys of being Filipino American is having Filipino food. Because I think that's something that translates to the next generation really fast. Like I remember I went to the Philippines and I got polvoron, and then I came to the US and I brought polvoron I brought it to the youth, and the youth, like, it didn't matter, like none of them really spoke Tagalog. And then, like, it doesn't matter, like, how much of a Filipino culture was that they had, but they knew what polvoron was, and they were, like, excited to eat it. So I think, food definitely translates over to American or Filipino American culture. And let's see what else. What are other Filipino American experiences? I think the experience, I guess for me, because I'm second gen, it's I grew up in a Filipino household, so my parents, I guess they had Filipino speaking in the house. Like my parents spoke Ilocano, and then when I go to school, I get that exposure to American culture, and So yeah, I think that's the common Filipino American experience. Like at home or at church, Filipino churches, you have the Filipino culture that you're exposed to, and then you go to school, you have the American culture that you're exposed to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. How about you?
Common Filipino American experience.
Maybe you can speak from the culture shock side, like the first gen side.
Culture shock?
Culture shock, yeah.
For people who move here, I guess. But you don't experience that though.
I don't experience. Yeah.
You don't. That's the second gen.
Yeah. But the first gens do. So
yeah, the first gen do. The first gen. That's a quite interesting question though, because you said common Filipino American experience. A lot of first gen don't consider themselves Filipino American.
Really?
Yeah, does your dad consider himself Filipino? I guess so, because he's.
I have some Filipino. I know some Filipino people who were first gen who they realize that America is their home now. So
yeah, see, I don't know. I feel like most titos and titas, even though they've been here for so long, consider themselves more Filipino than Filipino American.
Okay.
Or maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. Yeah,
You know.
I guess I'm not sure. I never heard my parents say that they're Filipino American. So
They never said that to you?
well, they never said like that phrase. Like I consider myself Filipino American, but I assume that they are Filipino American just because that they're first gen. So I assume that they're Filipino American. I guess because like in my mind, the idea of identifying as Filipino American wasn't a precursor or a precondition to being Filipino American.
Yeah, like in my mind, I feel like titos and titas identify themselves more as Filipinos.
Yeah, but in my mind, I would say that they're still Filipino American by virtue of them living in America.
Yeah. Okay.
Because like I'm thinking of like history books, like when in a history book when they write down Filipino Americans, the first ones who came here, they're talking about the people like our parents. So
yeah. So I guess that's kind of like a difference, even with us, just trying to figure out who's Filipino and who's Filipino American.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of interesting because we have this conversation in the car. Like we ask Harper, my son, like, "Are you Filipino or American?" Like Filipino American. But it's interesting when this conversation comes up because I feel like I identify myself as Filipino American, but I don't know if my wife does.
Yeah, it's interesting too because like you can move here for like a year and then go back to Philippines. I guess in the history definition, you are Filipino American because you lived some part of your time in America, but you're basically just Filipino in culture.
Yeah, who visited the U.S.
Yeah. So I think it's like, I think I understand your definition, like your way of defining it is more of like the cultural definition. And then my way of defining it, like I still agree with your side, but I think my way of defining is like, how does the history books, what would they say or consider people as Filipino American? Yeah. So in the history book definition, self-identification is not important. But in the cultural definition, that self-identification is important.
Yeah, I think this kind of leads me to the question you have here under the common Filipino experience. You ask, have you ever had an identity crisis, struggle between being American or Filipino? Yeah, definitely that one, yes.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so, I grew up in the Philippines. And moved to the US when I was 15 or 16. And so for my first year of culture shock, all I wanted to do was go home. Like I didn't want to make friends after a while, right? After the first 3 or 4 months of like, wow, this is America. Everything's nice. but then I couldn't go out, couldn't ride the jeepney. I didn't have as much freedom as I had in the Philippines, and I couldn't relate to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that time, like, I was rejecting everything about America. I just wanted to go back because that's where I belonged.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't belong in the US. I go to church and nobody spoke my language. I have to be the one to adjust to English. And maybe this is just a personal thing, right? It probably doesn't speak to everybody. But, there was that time where I'm rejecting American culture. Like, I didn't want to be in it.
Mm.
Um, but over the years, of course, through the years, as I get used to it here, and I go to school here, I make friends here, then slowly I'm beginning to enjoy living in the US more, beginning to have more friends, part of me is beginning to really belong in this place where I'm at.
Yeah.
And then you start thinking about, okay, you start comparing both cultures and figuring out, where you're at on that spectrum, which ones you accept, which ones you reject. So I'm kind of comfortable now where I'm at. I think I could relate to both cultures, but definitely there was a struggle between being American or Filipino, especially in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Because it feels like you're turning your back on something you've known for so long to embrace like a new culture. Because you have to embrace that new culture in order to really enjoy living here. Because if you don't, then you're not going to enjoy living where you're at.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to forget who you are, but you just have to accept new realities and new cultures and new ways of thinking about stuff and new ways of customs and behaviors.
Yeah.
Like even just the simple concept of time. Like, I just have to accept that I have to be early, or I have to be there on time.
Mm-hmm.
To show respect.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to clarify two parts that you said. Is there a time when you were like, how did you come to embrace American culture then? Since you mentioned embrace, the importance of embrace.
Yeah, I think it's when I started to have deeper relationships with people who are not exactly very Filipino. And then also when I started working here and going to school here and realizing and seeing, what it's like to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was it was there a switch in your mind that said, I need to embrace American culture, or was it just gradual?
I think it's both. So one of the switches was when I went back to the Philippines, and I realized that you kind of have to see the difference, right? When I went back, and I'm like, okay, I don't have as much friends here anymore. They've all moved on. I kind of like the system in the US. I don't like the traffic as much, but like I kind of like how some things are run, right?
Uh,
I still compare it, but I still kind of like how warm relationships are within the Filipino community. So,
yeah.
There's things that you accept and you reject.
Okay.
Um,
So that was a gradual thing
yeah,
for
I think
you.
it's a gradual thing. It's both gradual and a switch. It's not like one big switch. It's like multiple little small switches.
Okay. And then also the other thing I wanted to ask was, like, you identify as Filipino American now, but I'm sure that when I asked the Aaron in 2004, he would identify as Filipino.
That's right. Yeah.
So-
Because like, I think at that time, like again, I was really into like Filipino music. I had Filipino friends. And you have to understand, when I was in the Philippines, like the friendships are really deep, and it's like my I guess like my pride being a Filipino is really high. I'm still very proud to be a Filipino. But yeah, I think it's just that when you're in culture shock, you can't really see the value of one culture over another. Especially if you're on that stage of like, a culture shock has different stages. The first one, I think, is where you are in awe, and then there's that stage of like you miss everything, and then there's that stage of like, I hate everything about this culture.
Yeah.
So especially if you're in that stage.
So I guess your identification as being Filipino American, it comes hand in hand with your embrace of Filipino American or American culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So.
Yeah.
What about
Interesting.
you? Yours is kind of different.
Yeah. So I did have an identity crisis too, or struggle between being American and Filipino. I think the first thing I would say is like I was definitely American, but I had the identity crisis when I guess this is also common Filipino Americans experience. This would go under that question. Is that there were a lot of adults who kind of like shamed me for being American, or there were a lot of Filipinos who shamed me for being American. Like they would say, "Oh, you don't speak Tagalog? That's a shame." Or like they would say like, "Oh, you don't understand the hardship that we gone through. Like you only know the good part of life. You don't understand the struggle." So like they made me feel bad for being American, or like growing up in America. So I think at that point I felt like, I should probably reconnect with my Filipino roots, or I should try to be Filipino.
Yeah.
So I went through that time period where I was trying to be more immersed in Filipino culture. And then, I was like more trying to be more Filipino. So I learned Tagalog and learned my parents' language. And I think to sum it all up, there was a point in my life where I realized, there was a point in my life where, like, after that period of time when I was trying to be Filipino, there was a point in my life where I realized I'm actually a Filipino American. And that happened when I went to the Philippines, and I was in the Philippines for like a month or so.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just had to follow my cousin's lead the whole time, because like my cousin, like every time we went out, I would just say like, what's the right thing to do here, or what should I do in this situation? Am I supposed to do this, or am I supposed to do that? Do I go this way? Do I go that way? And then I just follow my cousin's lead. So that constant feeling of having to follow my cousin's lead, not knowing Filipino culture, like Filipino, like when I'm talking about lead, I'm talking about like when we go out to eat, or like when we go to the mall, or when we take a jeepney, like how does that all work? So I had to follow my cousin. And then when I came to America, I guess like that feeling of me having to like adjust to the culture was lifted. I was like, when I came to America, I went to Shoppers, or I went to Safeway, and I was like, man, I know exactly how to drive. I know exactly how to behave. I don't feel like I'm always constantly being watched. Like in the Philippines, I was always conscious of talking, because I don't want to talk, because I don't want the cashier to know that I don't speak Tagalog, or like the waiter or the waitress. I don't want them to know that I don't speak Tagalog, so I just keep my mouth shut. But in America, when I was in America, like I feel like I didn't have to worry about that because I knew exactly how to order food. I know how to use the self checkout line. So I was like, oh, I like America. I mean, I feel like I'm at home here. So I like that American identity was like sealed. Like I was like, okay, I'm American for sure. But at the same time, a little time after that, I was starting to feel like, wait, America doesn't actually understand me though, because I feel like an immigrant still in America because of the color of my skin. So where do I fit? So I think Filipino American was like the identity where I felt like I fit.
Yeah.
So I that's when I settled on that identity as being Filipino American.
It's interesting. Your experience of going to the Philippines and not knowing how to behave is the same experience I have here. Not knowing how to behave and being shamed for being a fob and having an accent.
Okay.
But by younger people, but by my peers. So
well,
it's kind of like the same thing. Until now, some of our friends still shame me. Talking to you. I'm just kidding. You know what I'm talking about.
I know who you're talking about. I hope he's listening.
But yeah, that's you make a really interesting point. For me, it's kind of different though, because I feel at home on both cultures.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I still feel at home in America, but I think it's not like. I guess one of the realizations was too is like in America, everyone is different, right? Like when I was in Safeway, I had that realization that there was different races there, and we were all. It's okay, like it's okay. That's part of the American experience.
Yes.
So I think like in that sense, I feel American, like I feel at home.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think I feel more at home when I'm around people who are Filipino American. So I would say that.
That's interesting. I think that's why America is it's probably one of the best places for immigrants to be at, because almost every other country is like mono. Like the Philippines, it's mostly Filipinos, right? Or in China, it's mostly Chinese. But America is like there's a lot more immigrants from all over.
Yeah, and in a sense, everyone is an immigrant. I mean, I think Neo mentioned this in the first episode. Yeah. I think it depends, though, on what part of America you're in.
Yeah, same.
Like if you're in Iowa.
We might be wrong. There might be a lot of Filipinos there. Who knows? Sorry if for the listeners, Filipino listeners now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think we can move on to the next question. I think this is interesting. So, what parts of Filipino culture are retained in the Filipino American culture, do you think?
Well, I know for sure that first generation Filipinos want to retain the sort of respect.
Okay. Yeah, respect.
That we show each other.
Yeah.
I know for sure that even in Filipino Americans that there's at least that warm hospitality. That's why we work so well as nurses, right? Definitely know that a lot of times language is the last thing retained in Filipino cultures.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you that I guess respect.
Food is definitely retained.
Oh yeah, yeah. We mentioned that food is retained. Yeah, the respect to elders is retained. Yeah, even my youth, they understand that, like respect, like they should respect their elders.
Kind of interesting that Filipino Americans, even if they don't speak Tagalog, they will call you kuya or tito or tita.
Oh yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
To show respect.
Yeah, and even like the youth, they show me respect because I'm their kuya. So they've yeah they understand that. I've seen that there. They understand that.
The concept.
Yeah, they understand that concept that if I'm their kuya, they can't talk to me like in a certain way. Yeah, but yeah, I think one thing. Yeah, I would like to talk about that a little bit. One thing that wasn't retained is Tagalog or Filipino. Why do you think that Filipino? Why do you think that that's hard to retain? I think a lot of first gen Filipino Americans are probably thinking that or wondering that. Why is it they don't retain Tagalog?
I don't know. What do you think? I'll let you go on this one first.
Yeah, well, it's appropriate for me to answer the question. I think it's because we are not. I think I didn't learn Tagalog because there's not much. I guess because my school is not speaking in Tagalog, or like my friends don't speak Tagalog. So like in church in my
Okay,
Filipino.
hold on. So why don't are you talking about your Filipino friends?
I'm talking about my American friends.
Okay, but Chinese people or Korean people have American friends, but they speak their language.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, my Chinese friends and Korean friends. Well, I think my Korean friends I don't think they retain the language either. But my Chinese friends, they retain it better. I think maybe in part because Chinese people have Chinese school. So they learn the language, or they're forced to learn the language. And then I think also because their parents at home, when they speak to their parents speak to them in Chinese. Like in my experience, my Chinese friends, they would speak to their parents in Chinese. But I guess in my experience, I didn't learn Tagalog because my parents don't speak Tagalog. I mean, they speak Tagalog, but they don't speak Tagalog to me. And also they don't speak Tagalog to each other. So I didn't. And then they speak Ilocano at home, but they don't speak to Ilocano to me. So I don't learn Ilocano. So I think if you want, for the first gens out there who want their kids to learn the Filipino language, you should speak to your kids in your language purely, and then they'll pick up English when they go to school. Is what I would say. Yeah.
Let me kind of address that speaking to your kids. I think for us, we did that for our kids. We tried to talk to them purely in Tagalog, but then, like, I don't know. This is probably just our kid, but he didn't talk. He started like talking late. And they're saying part of that is because maybe he hears two languages or three even, right? As opposed to maybe if it was just English. That could be, that's just our example. But yeah, I think talking to your kids in your native tongue would help. But you also mentioned that, that your parents spoke Ilocano. So part of like the struggle with Filipinos is we don't have like just one language. We have so many dialects.
Yeah.
And so at home, like if we have a Filipino community in the US, they probably will speak Tagalog. But even in that community, like you have Ilocano, Kankanaoy, Ibaloy, or whatever, or like Ilonggo, there is like, or Cebuano, there's so many different dialects. But I think one of the reasons maybe that Filipino, it's a lot of reasons that kind of combine together. But in the Philippines, we use English as our medium of instruction. And our parents can't speak English. They're comfortable with that. Now, I'm not sure about other cultures.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm assuming, like, for example, in China, they don't use English as their main language for instruction. And so to begin with, our parents already are comfortable with English, right? They can speak in English. Second, I think there's a high respect for people, at least in our parents' generation. There's kind of like that, like, wow, like this guy can speak English. Like there's a high respect for people who can speak English, right? So like a high view of that, as
Yeah.
opposed to maybe other cultures, like they prioritize learning their language.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Like there's more respect if you can speak your own language, as opposed to like being able to speak English. Third, I think Filipinos are very adaptable. Now that's good, but it can also be bad because like we try to adapt in every situation, we try to fit in every situation, and that means like even speaking that kind of spills over even with like speaking English.
Yeah.
So like we speak English at home, speak English to our children, and frankly also fourth, maybe is it's easier that way to communicate that way to our children. So I think those kind of things help to I guess like help in this this thing where Filipino kids don't speak Tagalog.
Yeah, those are
Yeah,
all good points.
Yeah, it's almost as if like it's not necessary for them to like speak Tagalog.
Yeah.
And you're thinking like, well, are my kids ever gonna go to the Philippines? Are they ever gonna use this language? So
Yeah. I think in your case, I know that is a problem. I've had coworkers who are like Vietnamese. They say that they had that problem too. Like they are like a lot of parents have told me that too. Where like I say, why didn't you teach your kid Tagalog? Like that's something I wish my parents did to me. And then they'll say, yeah, we tried, but they were having a hard time speaking in general, or like so they had to focus on one language. So I understand what you're saying, but then at the same time, at least in some Filipino Americans that I know who speak Tagalog, they told me that it's because their grandma or grandpa or their I think that's what they say. They say they had to learn Tagalog because that's the only language that their lola spoke. So maybe it's not the parent should speak to the kid. Maybe it's the lola and lolo who has to speak that language to them.
Yeah. And I think part of that too is like how much I guess like how much it seems like in other Asian cultures there's so much pride in who they are there's so much pride in who they are that they want to make sure that their children also are that have that same pride for their people group or their culture or their country.
You mean other Asians or
Yeah.
other diseases?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good point.
But yeah, I mean, I think definitely would help the church if Filipino Americans can speak Tagalog, because that's how you learn culture, or one way of learning culture and understanding culture.
Yeah, are you talking about the second gen? It'd be easier
second
for them.
gen. It would be easier, not just for second gen, but for first gen too. Right. Like, have you ever met someone who speaks Tagalog who does not understand Filipino culture or speaks like Filipino dialect?
No.
It seems like everyone who you've met that speaks Filipino dialect are more understanding of Filipino culture.
Yeah, good point.
Right.
Yeah.
So, if you're gonna have kids, what are you gonna do?
So this is the plan, but I don't know how it's gonna work, and I don't even know if we're gonna have kids. But we're thinking I'll speak to them in English, Sarah will speak to them in Tagalog, and then my parents will speak to them in Ilocano.
Yeah. So see, like even that, right? Like so many dialects, but I think for most other Asian cultures. I feel like they don't have that many dialects compared to us. Again, I might be wrong. I'm not as familiar with other Asian countries and their dialects. But for us, it's because, like, where a lot of Philippines is just really a group of islands with different cultures and different dialects.
Yeah.
I feel like it's easier if there was just one main Filipino language, right? Like for me, like my kids, right? I speak to them in English. My wife and I speak to them in English and Tagalog, and then my parents speak to them in Kankanay and Ilocano.
Oh man!
So it can be quite difficult. So then we might just focus on one for now, so they can adjust well in life here. And then our plan is to, well, at least I'm thinking that we will expose them as much to the Philippines as much as possible. So hopefully when this pandemic is over.
Why didn't you focus on Tagalog to them and then let them learn English when they get older?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Like we did, but then like he was already 3 or 4 and all he was saying was and you get worried and you're like, man, why is he not talking?
Yeah, but I think I'm confused because it's like as if you were in the Philippines, like he would have this. Would he have the same issue?
Yeah, but when you go to church, all the other kids are speaking. The other kids are speaking and they're talking in English, and your kid is not. So you're even though you really want to teach them your dialect, if they're not interacting, you're more worried about that than you're worried about them growing up and talking. In like Tagalog or another dialect.
So you decided to choose English because that's the language that everyone else is speaking.
Yeah, at a certain point we had to decide to do English, especially if he was going to go to school.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
But we're not giving up on that. I think it's important. For me, at least, I'm not as like gung ho about them becoming Filipino. Right. I want them to be gospel centered and accept what is good culture and reject what's not good. And there's good and bad in both cultures.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of like I think it's good to understand Filipino culture, but it's not good to force second generation to accept all of Filipino culture. If that means including the bad ones.
Right.
Same thing with American culture.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think something that I learned in my class, it's called perspectives, is that each culture has its blind spots.
Yeah.
And there's something that some cultures do better than others, and we need to learn from each other, and we need to grow. We need to, like, what you said, accept the good and reject the bad. And there's something good things we can learn from other cultures that we need to adopt.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've spoken for a long time now. Maybe we continue this in a different time or a different episode. But I think that's a lot of content to digest. So we'll close it here. Thank you everyone for watching, and please subscribe to our podcast, rate it 5 stars, and
5 stars.
If you have any other comments or it's something you don't agree with, we would love to hear from you. Or if you agree with us, then we'd love to hear from you. So please comment and let us know. All right. Peace.